Reports over the weekend indicate that the Chinese government is quietly involved in a massive project to refurbish one of South Africa's key military bases. The redesign and upgrading of the Defence Forces Mobilization Centre at De Brug outside Bloemfontein will cost about 500 million rand. This is according to City Press sister publication Rapport. Joining us to discuss these reports, implications for South Africa's sovereignty, for the National Defence Force, maybe also some geopolitical matters. We're joined by Deputy Editor at the Daily Friend, Ricardo Teixeira. Ricardo, thank you very much for making time here with the CRA once again on a Monday afternoon. So let's get straight into it. Legitimate reports?
I believe the report is legitimate. I have had sources within the DoD and the Defence Force that have been aware of this, and I've heard rumors about this discussion since about July. I was not privy to any of the details, but with the details that have been shared in the article in the report this weekend, there are legitimate concerns about the threat to our sovereignty in this project.
First, before we get into the sort of sovereignty implications, maybe how this kind of thing would develop should it proceed, is this unprecedented? Does this kind of thing ever happen? Has it happened in South Africa?
On the international stage, this has happened. We do see countries paying for military infrastructure in other countries. For example, Germany now, their 4th Panzer Brigade has built their own base in Lithuania, where they are going to be permanently housed in Lithuania as part of the NATO-ready battle group structures along the Baltics. And typically when you see a country invest in military infrastructure in another country, it's because both parties require it. Now, that is typically done, for example, the US has done this all over the world. They've done it at Al Udeid Air Base. They're I believe that's in Qatar. They've got bases in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Ramstein Air Base is a NATO air base that the US built up in Germany. This has international precedence. However, this has no precedence in South Africa. There have not been any military bases or any military infrastructure in South Africa that has been paid for by a foreign state.
Ricardo, when we look at the reporting, sort of on surface level, we talk about things like refurbishment, maybe light maintenance. So on the surface, it's not building new facilities, as it were. So I'm trying to maybe steel man a bit here, that it's not the worst possible form of foreign, military investment. Can I put it that way? Or assistance?
Look, the details are a bit scarce at the moment. It's quite vague as to what exactly they're going to be paying for. The Brug itself is a mobilization and training base, so it houses a lot of warehouses that are meant to be temperature-controlled warehouses that hold equipment that is in ready reserve. So this is equipment, to my knowledge, although I can't publicize them, I have seen inside and have images of the inside of those warehouses, and there seems to be a large number of Mamba APCs and G6 Rhino self-propelled artillery that's stored there. Their condition isn't that great, considering that the temperature-controlled environment has not been maintained, but they are a lot better than storing them out in the open. So that infrastructure does require an upgrade. But the other part of the base is a very large firing range and some areas for training, but it's mainly open ground. So in terms of upgrading the infrastructure, the storage would be deserves an upgrade, in my opinion. And definitely for the repair of vehicles and the readiness of vehicles that are being ready to be deployed, that infrastructure is also necessary. However, again, we don't know exactly what it is they're going to be paying for and why they've chosen De Brug other than it's a logistical base. Now, logistical bases tend to be important bases. They allow for the projection of force. For example, the very controversial Diego Garcia base that the US maintains in the middle of the Indian Ocean, that is a logistical airbase. It's got a long enough runway that the US can land whatever they want there. It's got fuel storage. It's got hangars. It's got water salination. It's got housing for troops. I mean, even China's base in Djibouti, you could argue is a logistical base, but it's more on the maritime side. The Brug is an interesting place to put a base because it's right in the middle of the country, so it's quite centrally located. But one thing it lacks is an airstrip. So I'd be interested to see what sort of upgrades they're talking about, because if there's an airstrip, I'd be even more alarmed because that would allow for the air delivery of equipment. And and that would be quite interesting because there's been no talk of us needing an airstrip there.
Ricardo, if we look a little bit sort of at the state of the South African National Defence Force, you've written extensively about this. Your latest piece at the Daily Friend sort of tackles how you would allocate the scarce resources available as best as possible.
If I was fortunate enough to be in the position to do so.
Yes, if you were king, to quote our colleague, to paraphrase our colleague Terence Corrigan. But this wasn't one of the suggested items on your list, correct?
No, what I focused on there was more logistical capacity, and what I spoke about is what I spoke about there was a 20 billion rand stimulus influx to kind of start turning things around and what you'd be able to do with it. The focus there is also on projection, but I focused on the logistical fleet, so vehicles. It's not very sexy, but the army needs vehicles. If you want to move for a combat deployment or sustainable combat action, you need to be able to roughly. The rule of thumb is you want to be able to move 10,000 tons now, which means you need either 1,000 10-ton trucks or 10 trains that can haul 1,000 tons, or you need 2 very big ships. We have neither of those. So I focus on overhauling SANDF's logistical fleet of trucks, the SAML 20s and the SAML 100s and the SAML 50s, with a fleet of logistical vehicles, and then just maintenance of what is in inventory at the moment, specifically the rotary wing fleet, the Oryx, because that allows us to deploy anywhere. In a continent that lacks a lot of formal infrastructure, trucks are great, but helicopters are better.
On the surface of it, so you did allude to there is some precedent for this kind of thing. Given South Africa is part of BRICS, which isn't a military alliance, but given that we're part of BRICS
is a political alliance, not military.
Yeah. So given that, if you were to identify countries that wouldn't raise as many red flags, maybe in BRICS or elsewhere, would there be any that you think, okay, go for this kind of thing, South Africa lean into this? Would it be maybe India, maybe a European country? Would there be less, concern domestically, but also from some of our more important trading partners and diplomatic, partners, such as the United States?
The only countries that I would be in favor of us taking this step with would be the French and the Indians. We have an extensive defense cooperation agreement with the French, and they happen to own 2 islands or control 2 islands in the Mozambique Channel, Europa Island and Juan de Nova Island, which have runways on them. And being able to use those islands and to have shared infrastructure on them would allow us to more effectively patrol the Mozambique Channel and to project throughout the channel. The same with India on Agaliga Island, which they are leasing control and allowed to have a presence on, thanks to an agreement with the Seychelles. I think it's the Seychelles. That island is on the
I think we might have lost Ricardo, so I'm going to give him a few seconds to come back to us, hopefully. I'll go further into the story and additional reporting that we have received over the weekend in terms of exactly what is happening, allegedly happening, with this particular Chinese investment into South Africa. So if we look at, for example, the possibility and the fact that this project has been labeled as classified and even highly secret by the Defense Force, that in and of itself raises questions about things like sovereignty, implications for the military, the SANDF, our intelligence services. How secret or not are these particular entities, these kinds of developments? How are they reported on or not? So if they're clouded in secrecy, exactly what can citizens do? What oversight is there? If Parliament doesn't do its job adequately, how does this sort of thing come to light? If we look, for example, at the fact that this project, which has now been confirmed, the name is Project Zingisa, it only came to light recently when it was mentioned in passing during a discussion of the Defense Forces annual report before the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Defense. I mean, that in and of itself, if it only came to light sort of by accident, also raises questions in terms of legitimacy, et cetera, et cetera. If one goes a little bit further into those implications for secrecy and oversight, I think there are serious questions to be asked here in terms of how one deals with this going forward, how one makes sure that there is the kind of oversight that we need. If one looks at the government individuals, representatives who need to take accountability here and who need to be sort of, I guess, pressured to give South Africans the necessary information. The first name that jumps to mind is the Minister of Defense, Angie Motshekga. She very probably needs to explain why the Chinese military has access to strategic military infrastructure. And I think that's the least of that South Africans can expect in this regard. We've also got the element around sort of democratic participation and oversight, where the question is, why should such projects be shielded behind clandestine classification, as this amounts to a direct assault on the country's sovereignty? So pressure on the minister, pressure on other high-level individuals in the government as well. I think if we go on a little bit further, just talking about the site itself at the Brug, thousands of soldiers usually prepare for overseas deployments or return from such deployments at the Brug. It also includes a vast training area, firing ranges, and other facilities. So it is very important. So as Ricardo has alluded to in our discussion here today, but also in his other analysis and articles, the SANDF and its facilities are in a very poor, if not decrepit state. So it's little surprise that there's a desire for more investment to come in from places like China. But again, the question is around how this is being done. When we look at more recent developments at the Brug, we also had mobilization and airlift of equipment for external deployments. That happened via the Brug that happened at Lehotla via Uppington. So there are one or two other facilities of a similar level, but I think one should also look at just the importance of some of them. Maybe just a very last point around sovereignty and accountability. If one looks at the importance of things coming to light versus being sort of cloaked in secret, usually one asks more questions and there are more red flags with things happening behind closed doors. When everything is classified or termed as classified, when it's accompanied by diplomatic platitudes, all of that sort of thing undermines a country's military sovereignty and constitutional accountability. We're seeing on a daily basis things developing around the Madlanga Commission, the revelations, the allegations by Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi from KwaZulu-Natal around SAPS and the intelligence services, and allegations of close ties with criminal syndicates and criminal individuals. If you take what's happening there, South Africa's experience with things like state capture, and also now this sort of secrecy and lack of transparency around this particular development, this alleged Chinese investment at the Brug, that continues to undermine the sort of democratic and constitutional project in South Africa as well. It undermines accountability in that regard too. I think maybe a last point on which to close. I think South African businesses especially, South African civil society, are entitled to full disclosure of clandestine contracts between the Defence Force and other countries' governments, including those with countries that the ANC specifically views as close historical allies, those being Cuba and China. Those agreements, at the very least, must be reviewed by Treasury and the Auditor General, especially if there's South African tax money that's going to be involved. I'm going to wrap us up on that note, but hopefully we can do a further extended discussion with Ricardo at some point, and then we will schedule that in due course. Thank you all for making time with us here today, and we'll chat with you again very soon.